It's late at night. The world is quiet. The air is still. You're lying in bed, eyes open, your mind gently spinning with thoughts that refuse to settle. So, let's take a journey together. A slow, strange journey into a forgotten corner of history. Not the kind filled with glory, kings and battles, no. This one's darker, more uncomfortable, and somehow soothing in its own sad absurdity. Let's talk about what it was like to be a medieval executioner. Not a king, not a knight, just a man with an axe, or a rope, or a burning stake. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't heroic, and, for the most part, it sucked. You see, in the Middle Ages, people didn't dream of becoming executioners. No child looked up at his father and said, "One day, I want to chop off people's heads for a living." In fact, in most towns and villages, the job was given to people who had no choice. Sometimes it was a punishment. You commit a crime, but instead of being executed yourself, you're offered a grim bargain. Take the axe or face it. Other times, it was hereditary. Your father was the executioner, so you became one too. Not because you wanted to, but because nobody else would take your place. The role was cursed, in a way. Once marked, you stayed marked. Executioners were feared and hated, not because they were evil, but because they reminded people of death, of justice, of pain, of guilt. They were necessary, but they were never welcomed. They couldn't live inside the town walls. They were forced to live on the outskirts, near the gallows or the execution grounds. They had to dig graves, clean up after hangings, burn the remains of those condemned by the church. Their homes smelled of smoke and blood. People didn't touch them, didn't talk to them. In some places, even priests refused to bless them. Imagine that, doing the town's dirtiest work and being treated like a ghost. Now let's talk tools. The axe, of course, is the most famous, but here's a secret. It was rarely quick. Executioners weren't always trained. They didn't go to school for this. So when the time came to swing, it wasn't always one clean blow. Sometimes it took two, sometimes three. And if the axe was dull, well, the screams could go on for minutes. The crowd didn't mind, though. In fact, they liked it. They came early, brought food, treated it like a festival. Children on shoulders, vendors selling snacks. Executions were public entertainment. The more gruesome, the better. The executioner, just part of the show, he stood in black or red, sometimes with a hood, not to hide his identity. Everyone already knew who he was, but to keep blood from splashing into his eyes. There were other methods too. Hanging was common, but slow. The goal was to break the neck instantly, but more often, the condemned. Man would dangle, kicking and choking, for several minutes. It depended on the knot, the rope, the drop. Too short and he suffocated, too long and the head came off entirely. Neither was graceful. Then there was burning. Witchcraft, heresy, blasphemy. These crimes ended in fire. Executioners built. The pyres stacked the wood, lit the flames. Sometimes they were kind enough to strangle the victim first. Other times, not. Torture was part of the job too. Confessions were extracted with tools that sound like they belong in horror films. The rack, the Iron Maiden, the thumbscrew. Pain drawn out like a slow symphony. Executioners learned where the nerves were, how to break a man without killing him, at least not right away. It wasn't about justice. Not really. It was about fear, control, power. You might think executioners were cold-hearted, that they enjoyed their work, but many were tormented. They drank heavily, lived alone, had no wives, no children. Their hands shook. Their sleep was broken. In some places, the law required them to pay for their sins. After each execution, they'd go to church, if the church allowed them in, and confess. But what do you confess when your sin is your job? Even worse, what happens when you make a mistake? If an executioner failed, if the blade slipped or the knot broke, the crowd turned. Stones would fly, rotten food, sometimes worse. The executioner became the villain. The spectacle turned on him. In one famous case, an English executioner botched the beheading of a noblewoman, hitting her shoulder first, then missing twice more before finally ending it. He was nearly lynched. There was no applause, no glory, just sweat and blood and silence, and yet they were necessary. Kings and queens needed them. Courts depended on them. Justice, or something like it, moved forward only because someone was willing to do the work. And here's the strangest part of all. Some executioners became famous. There were men whose skills were so precise, so quick, that they were called upon by royalty. Given gold, even land. They weren't loved, but they were respected, in a twisted way. But still they lived in the shadows. When they walked into a tavern, people left. When they entered the market, prices doubled. They were cursed by association. It's a strange place to be, both servant and monster, invisible and unforgettable. There were other duties too. Executioners often served as health inspectors. Yes, truly. In many towns, the same man who swung the axe also cleaned the streets, examined corpses for disease, and burned contaminated homes, because no one else wanted to touch the dead. And so, in a world obsessed with purity and sin, the executioner lived surrounded by both, always near death but never quite part of the living. And what about when they died? Executioners weren't. Buried in churchyards. Their graves were unmarked, forgotten. Sometimes their bones were dug up years later and discarded like trash. No legacy, no statue, no songs, just dust. And yet they kept going, day after day, swinging the blade, lighting the fire, pulling the rope, because someone had to. And now, centuries later, they are mostly forgotten. Their names erased, their lives buried, under layers of more interesting history. Kings, wars, castles, that's what we remember. Not the man in the hood, not the one standing in the mud, waiting for the signal. Not the one who looked into the eyes of the condemned and said nothing. And maybe that's why we talk about them now, in the quiet of the night, when sleep hasn't come. When the world feels a little too sharp around the edges, because even the forgotten deserve a place in the story, even the ones we'd rather not think about. So rest now. Let history fade into silence. Let the fire burn low. Let the axe grow dull. Tomorrow is another day, and tonight you are far from the gallows, safe still asleep.